I'm really excited today to welcome a new speaker in the EES event program, not just the online one, but the event program in general. I'm delighted to welcome Matt Szafran today. What a lot of you might not know is actually Matt and I had talked about doing an event about pre-dynastic palettes as early as January this year, and we had planned on this day to run an interactive workshop, which would have included background on palettes, but also an interactive element where attendees could create their own palette. Unfortunately, that's not been able to go ahead because of the coronavirus pandemic, but Matt has very kindly and at short notice agreed to turn that workshop into an online lecture. So for the next hour, Matt's going to be talking about pre-dynastic palettes and introduction, and this builds on Matt's own research in experimental archaeology as well, on palette use and manufacture. And as somebody who knows very little about pre-dynastic palettes, this is a really exciting craft to learn about from ancient Egypt. I'm also really excited to say that he has an article coming out in the Birmingham Egyptology Journal on Monday. And for those of you who don't know what the Birmingham Egyptology Journal is, it's an open access, a free to access journal online on the Birmingham Egyptology website. I don't know if anybody's from Birmingham Egyptology in the chat, but perhaps they can send a link, and I will send you all a link in the follow-up email. He will also be presenting this research as part of the British Egyptology Congress, which, as with many conferences at the moment, will be online in September. So again, look out for notices on our website and social media channels about that. So thank you so much, Matt, for today joining us on a Saturday to talk to us about pre-dynastic palettes. I'm really excited to learn more about this, and I will hand over to you now. Thank you so much.
Hopefully you can all see and hear me now. Carl, am I visible?
Yes, you are.
Oh, thank you everyone for giving up some Saturday. Here in the UK, it's a very sunny Saturday and it's quite tempting to go outside. I appreciate you sitting here for this instead. If you're following on social media, there's a hashtag of palettes and intro, and I look forward to catching up on all that later. So I think we need to start by discussing what the pre-dynastic Egypt actually is. Most people are probably more familiar with the dynastic times, with kings, pharaohs, pyramids, golden things. The pre-dynastic era is before that. They're looking at the time period of sort of between 6000 to 3150 BCE. Egyptologists don't like using dates, so we'll call that pre-dynastic. And essentially this time is a time of different tribes of people forming small communities, becoming larger and larger up until we finally move into the early dynastic times. If you see on the right-hand side of the slide, those are the different tribes and the sort of different times they live in. And as far as palettes go, there's only 4 that we really concern ourselves with. And I will make a side note that I'm ignoring the Sudanese culture. They do have palettes, but they're not quite the same. Maybe that's something for later. So the first culture who had palettes that we know of were the Badarians. They're one of the Upper Egyptian cultures, and much like later times, there is an Upper and Lower Egypt, ultimately being unified by a king. They were followed by the Amratians of Naqada I, followed by the Lower Egyptian culture of Gerza, or Naqada II, and the Semain of Naqada III after those. So now that we know who they are, where were they from? Hopefully you can see my mouse. So the Badarians were located here in Upper Egypt, but not quite the main center of Upper Egypt, being Luxor's about here-ish. Then the main culture that thrived was the Naqadans here, very close to modern Luxor and modern Thebes. Before we move down to the Gerzan culture and then back again to Upper Egypt. Also to bear in mind for later is the Wadi Hammamat that's in the Eastern Desert. We'll see why that's important later. And following Campbell's lead from an earlier lecture, this is where I complain about Petrie. Whilst he is often cited as being the father of Egyptology, not everything he says was right, not everything he says was from the right place. And I think there's a colonial lecture further on in this series that will cover that in much more detail. This is the oldest quote I can find that, and it still forms most people's expectations of what a palette is. If you go into most museums, their labeling will be based loosely around the statements in this, and a lot of it's not right. A lot of it is right, interestingly, and some of his guesses were correct, but also there are some problems in amongst this, which throughout this lecture we'll address. And hopefully after the lecture, you'll understand palettes a little bit better. And the next time we're allowed to go into a museum, you can be a little more critical of the labels that you're reading. So firstly, palettes aren't made out of slate. Contrary to what Petrie said, they're not slate. I'm not a geologist, although there might be one in the room. I don't think there's even slate in Egypt. Instead, palettes are made out of greywacke or siltstone, and all of the material used in pre-dynastic palettes comes from the Wadi Hammamat. Whether it's the upper cultures or the lower cultures, every palette was made from greywacke or siltstone from that location. As a little geology primer for you all, greywacke it's a sedimentary material. It's formed in marine environments, usually off the edge of a continental shelf, where fine sediment washes down to the seabed, and with a mix of clays compacts into a very fine-grained material. And to use one of my favourite phrases, has advantageous cleavage, which is important for palettes as it allows you to process them into thin sections without too much work. Palettes have lots of different shapes. That's probably their most endearing quality, in my opinion. And these shapes change over time, but essentially they fall into a few main groups. You have animals. Fish and birds and turtles are probably the most common of the animals. And then you have more geometric shapes. The fish are by far and wide the largest category of single palette shape, followed by the rhomboids, and then oddly enough followed by shapeless palettes. Things like turtles and birds are much more rare. I do have a couple of theories as to why, and I do wonder if that a fish is a much easier shape to produce, so perhaps a turtle would be a more elite item, more so than a fish, as it takes significantly more work to produce one. As Carl mentioned, there is a course that will run as soon as we're allowed to be in the same room together, and anyone who attends that will begin to understand how much work goes into creating a fish, and anyone who's masochistic enough can have a go at creating a turtle. Okay, so looking back at the different cultures, they all have stylistically very different palettes. The Badarians have essentially two different forms. They're either an oval form or more of a rectangle form, and they all have notches out of the corners. So either this sort of in-cut notch or the more scooped kind on the other item. I would say personally, I don't find these terribly exciting. And when you've seen one, you've kind of seen them all. There are a number of theories about why they have these notches. The most common one seems to be some form of hanging loop that you could attach a cord to them and suspend them on your person or in your home. Although I must say I haven't tried that out and I'm not entirely sure how that would work. Moving into the Naqada I phase, essentially almost all of the palettes are rhomboid diamond shape. Some of them are very, very large, sort of 60 centimeters I have seen, down to very, very small, maybe 5 centimeters. If you read a lot of literature, you'll see comments that there is the central depression, which has been caused by grinding of pigment. That's shown on this one here in the middle. I'm not entirely sure that is a product of wear, because it seems very unlikely that you'd only wear a very small section in the center of a palette when you have this much larger surface area to work with. We'll also see later why the term grinding is completely erroneous. This particular palette, and I believe Ian from Bolton is attending, is in Bolton's collection, and when we are allowed out, I strongly recommend you go and visit the gallery. It's fantastic. This palette is interesting. It came from an EES dig in Hamamia, I believe, or possibly Omahasna. And it's the only palette I've ever found which still retains malachite crystals attached to it. There are palettes found with green staining, but not actual crystals. However, microscope analysis shows it appears to be glued onto the surface. So it looks like this is more a product of curatorial decisions rather than actual how it came out of the ground. And I did do some research in the EES archives, and none of the dig records for this site record any palette still retaining malachite from this grave. And as a side note, the little text underneath the palette is from the original curator of Bolton Museum, who wrote a letter to the EES on receipt of all of these, saying how the pre-dynastic things are very good. I would like an echo of that sentiment. Moving on from the Naqada I phase, in between Naqada I and II, we start to see the emergence of these kind of palettes. They're very small, sort of 5 centimeter roughly length. And most commonly they feature this double bird, although to me it looks kind of like double snakes, but it does appear to be more of a bird shape from later features. And as you can see on the left side, the UC 15847 in the Picture Museum is more of a stylistic bird. We do also see certain rhomboid palettes which have this kind of bird, double bird shape on the end of them, as maybe a kind of transition piece between those and between here. There's a lot of speculation about these and how they're probably not usable, how they were just purely an amulet, just purely for the properties, not any practicality. I'm going to come back to that point because I also don't think that's quite correct. Whilst they are small, there is the possibility that you could use them. This then led into the true Naqada II phase, where essentially it's an explosion of animals. We have pretty much every different animal in Egypt that you can think of. The fish are the most common. There are lots of different styles. I've put 2 on the slide just to show how vastly different certain examples can be. From this very small one with a drilled eye, with kind of spiky curly hair and a sort of big chin, through to the more oval shape of the other one. There's some interesting research that suggests certain palette shapes are absolutely the shape of certain species of Nile fish. I think there's evidence for that, but then there's also evidence that other fish are just the shape of a fish and it's not a specific example of a fish. So I think, like a lot of things, there's no one true answer, that you can't say every single fish palette was absolutely a certain species. You could say that in some cases, yes, they definitely were, and in other cases, they're just a generic shaped fish. We do also see a lot of the double bird kind of amulet. There's particular examples in Manchester Museum to make Campbell happy. They almost exclusively have inlays in their eyes. The inlays seem to begin at this time. We don't see many inlays in the previous slide with the small amulet type palettes. They are occasionally present, but mostly the inlays begin to start in the Naqada II phase. And the inlays are thought to be either something like ostrich egg, possibly bone. I've never seen it mentioned as ivory, and sometimes shell, like a seashell. I've only ever seen those as written assertions. I don't know if anyone's ever done any tests to see what they're actually made out of, or if it's just a little bit of speculation. Then we also see some very interesting animals. So the sort of top middle is something I found in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. And my wife's convinced it's a dinosaur. I'm not absolutely certain that's the case, but I do like the idea that there might be a dinosaur palette, and maybe it's a very proto version of Jurassic Park. More likely it's probably a cow type shape, or there is always the possibility that it's just a generic animal and it doesn't have to be a species. I think sometimes we're a little bit too carried away with maybe wanting to categorize everything and put everything in a box with a bow on it. And sometimes it isn't anything specific, or you'll also see palettes that have different characteristics from different animals. So there is a turtle palette, which mostly looks like a turtle, but then instead of back legs, it has cow horns. I think to Egyptians as a whole, there was always the ability to take pieces of different materials and say, well, this has these properties, but also these properties. And it's not necessarily a real life animal or a real life something else. We also see some interesting birds. The top right is usually referred to as a sort of guinea fowl or a quail. They're fairly common, but don't typically use an eye and have this sort of indentation instead. And then turtles. As we saw earlier from the slide, turtles are fairly rare, and I think museum galleries probably give us a very skewed idea of what is common and what isn't common. If you look at a gallery that contains pre-dynastic cultures, I'm specifically thinking about the BM at the moment, as they have quite a large collection on display. When you look at their cabinets, they show the strange and the exotic. So they have hippopotamus, they have lion, lots of different animals. In reality, those are the very rare ones. I'm currently working through a process to catalogue all of the palettes I can find in museum galleries. And so far, I've found 3 hippos. So see them on display. They're more the exception than they are the rule. And I think it's the curatorial decision to make the gallery look more interesting by having more interesting shapes rather than to look more representative by essentially being full of fish. There also exists a very interesting class of kind of conjoined palettes. Joe Smolik last year published a paper in Archaeonil discussing these in much further depth than I'm going to go into now. And anyone that's interested in these, I suggest you go and find that paper and give it a read. It's very interesting, and he's got some interesting ideas based on these, essentially suggesting that conjoined animals can exist in the wild. And it's quite possible that these existed for Nile creatures. And it's also possible that the pre-dynastic peoples saw these or had stories of other people who saw them and then used this as inspiration for their palettes. And that's given rise to some very interesting and very strange palettes. So we can see here the double turtle, which in Smolleck's paper, there is an example of a real life turtle that did survive and I believe was still alive when he wrote the paper, which was essentially conjoined and had two heads and would look very similar to this. And he draws the interesting comparison that the Egyptians could have seen something like that in the Nile and then based these palettes off them. Quite what they would mean rather than a standard single-headed four-legged turtle, we don't know. Does it have more significance? Is it twice as powerful? We don't know, and I suspect we'll never know. Then we also see the double fish and the double bird. This is something my wife is convinced are bikinis, and perhaps the first example of the bikini. I'm not entirely sure she's right with that, but they do have an interesting silhouette. It's possible these could be used more amuletically. You could string the tails, you could string the necks, because you'll notice that unlike most of the Naqada II palettes, these ones don't have any form of suspension hole. So the turtle does in its tail, but these ones, there's no kind of way to suspend them short of tying something extra to the pallets. Now, moving into Naqada III, essentially this is starting towards Egypt forming more of a state where there is one single king who is in charge of many different tribes, many different peoples, and also beginning to control access to both craftspeople and also control access to materials. We see that we go from the almost crazy menagerie of animals in Naqada II to something that's much more simple, where initially the majority of palettes are round or oval or square. Both of these come from the National Museum of Scotland's collection. And you can see that the round one has just some very simple carved detailing the edge, just a sort of V shape and line. And the rectangular one forms a sort of inset lines, and compared to the previous ones, not very exciting and doesn't require too much skill to create. It's essentially some very straight lines and a little bit of indentation. There is a mix of suspension holes. Some, like the one on the right, do have suspension holes, whereas the one on the left doesn't show them. There doesn't seem to be any rule, because you will find rectangular palettes that don't have suspension holes, and also you'll find rectangular palettes that do have suspension holes. The rightmost one is also quite interesting, as you see the remains of malachite staining on the surface. So that sort of green coloration left by the pigments. As we progress into the Naqada III phase, essentially the state is controlling more and more, and even the wealthy elites have less access to materials and less access to craftspeople, which means even if they're privileged enough to have a palette for themselves, what they'll see is they'll see very simple stones. And these two examples from the Peachy Museum are essentially shapeless stones, the sort of thing that you could find. You don't need to work it, you don't form it into any shape, and then you can use it. And as we move towards the end of the Naqada III phase, we'll see the so-called ceremonial palettes. And I'm using quotes and saying so-called, because there's a huge, in my opinion, there's a huge problem with that, that it means other palettes aren't ceremonial, which is not necessarily the truth. I think everyone's probably the most familiar with these. This particular example is the Nama palette, which is in the Cairo Museum. Some people will tell you it is an absolute journal of record, and this shows definite battles and definite events that happened. Other people will tell you it's a little bit more loose, and maybe it's a more of an idealized what happened, or idealized what would like to have happened. Again, like most of this, we're never going to know the truth. What I think is quite interesting is that even on these heavily decorated, heavily carved palettes, you'll still find somewhere, as on the recto side here, some sort of little well, a crushing area where pigments could still be processed on the palette, essentially echoing back to all of the previous designs and still retaining that core function whilst adding in all of this heavily carved, heavily detailed work. I haven't studied the ceremonial palettes very much, and if people are interested, you should look at the work of people like Catherine Paquette, who have been doing lots of detailed RTI and other advanced imaging to see how these things were made. And I know Catherine certainly has found some very interesting details regarding use, reuse, carving, the differences in what we actually see today versus how it might have been laid out originally. I'm not going to tread on her toes anymore. So let's come back to Petrie. Now that we know he's kind of right that palettes are of different figures of animals, birds, etc. We know he's wrong, that they're not slate. He thinks they were used for the grinding of malachite, and that this was probably used for painting the eyes. How do we process malachite? This is my own research, and I started this by trying to actually grind a section of malachite against a piece of quartz-veined basalt, which is quite rough and much rougher than the surface of a palette, but around the same hardness. And essentially it doesn't work. All you end up with is a tiny amount of dust and a slightly scratched piece of malachite. To actually process malachite to a small, fine powder that you need to create pigment, the best way I found to do it is to take your piece of malachite, to wrap it in some linen. Once it's wrapped in the linen, place it on a large piece of stone. In this case, I use sandstone, but it doesn't really matter. And then pound it with another hand stone. This will essentially give you lots of small shards and a small amount of dust. The linen is essential because when I didn't use it, I ended up with pieces of malachite everywhere, and it's quite friable. If you use the linen, the sort of modern analogy would be if you're going to create a cheesecake, you would take some biscuits, you would wrap them in cling film and hit them with a rolling pin, and then all of the crumbs stay together. It's the same sort of principle with malachite, that if you have some spare linen, some old linen handy, you could wrap it in that. If you have leather or some other fabric, you could use those. The material degrades very, very quickly as the malachite shatters and becomes quite sharp and tears through it. So this would be something that you would use scraps and old material for and not expect them to have much of a long life. But as you can see in this photo, the result of that is some fairly small shards down to about 10 mil and some very fine powder. What you can then do is you can take something flat and put your powder on there, put your small shards on there, and just gently crush them. It doesn't take any force at all. And this will render a very, very fine powder that you can then mix with a pigment, with based form pigment. The reason I said earlier that the amulet-sized palettes could possibly be used for pigment processing is essentially this example here. I've used a section which is maybe 3 to 4 centimeters long, roughly equivalent to the size of the amulets, and I was able to put small amounts of malachite on there, and using a pebble, this is just a very smooth river pebble, crush those crystals and produce this very fine powder. So just because something's small doesn't necessarily mean you can't use it. If you needed a large volume of material, then obviously this wouldn't be terribly effective. But if this was just purely as a personal adornment and you only needed a small amount, perhaps it is workable. As an interesting side effect of using linen, what happens is as the linen degrades and starts to break apart from the crushing process, it imparts a number of fibers into the resulting powder. The slide shows that this at 100 times magnification. And hopefully you can see that there are a number of very, very fine fibers running all throughout this. Measuring them using the microscope software means that I can tell you those fibers are anywhere between 8 micrometers and 23 micrometers. And the average is about 14, 15, which actually means that these are in places smaller than a human hair. So very, very fine fibers, but still quite long subjectively. And I do wonder if the presence of these microfibers actually forms a form of reinforcement into the malachite, which would help it stay together longer, so that when it is applied to something, the fibers reinforce it and the malachite would stay present longer. Something analogous to maybe how mud bricks contain straw, and the straw helps to bind the mud together and stop it falling apart. So moving on to how the pigments were used, there's essentially 2 different contexts. First, we need to look at the burial context. So we know that palettes are found in pre-dynastic burials. If you read enough ES publications and former archive reports, you'll see that, palettes are found with malachite residue, and also palettes are found with malachite next to them. Sometimes this is in little shells, other times it's in bags, sometimes there's loose crystals. I think it's very safe to say that it was correct that malachite is certainly associated with palettes, and especially in a burial context. We also have very scant, but there are remains at places like Edema where human remains have been found that still contain malachite residue around their eyes. This is the only site I know of which has this recorded, but it seems to be logical that if one site did it, then it's quite likely other sites would do it as well. And as I mentioned, we do see the malachite attached to different palettes and certainly alongside them. We also have objects found in the site of El Mahasna. There were clay heads found in grave H97, and those clay heads have malachite around their eyes. We don't have any good photos of them, and I don't know what institution they went to, but the heads are quite crude, but are definitely a head and do definitely have eyes, nose, mouth, and you can make out from the photos in the object catalogue that there is something around the eyes, and it is listed by the archaeologists that this was something that was malachite found. Then also we should look at the settlement context, and this is where it becomes slightly interesting and slightly different. So for people unfamiliar with the pre-dynastic area, the image on the left of the slide shows the round houses which most pre-dynastic people lived in. They were very simple mud huts with a mud plaster floor and a kind of wattle and daub for the walls, and presumably a straw roof. And palettes that are found in domestic contexts and palettes that are found in rubbish deposits at the sites, they all seem to contain ochre residue rather than malachite. The only exception that's been noted is that fish palettes seem not to be associated with ochre even in a settlement context. And generally speaking, you're going to find those with either no pigment residue, or you'll find them with malachite. It does seem that the presence of the other pigments mean perhaps that the everyday use context was different to the use for burials. I'd also like to note that galena is very, very, very rarely seen. From one of the archive reports I saw, it was perhaps one pallet out of an entire site was found with possible galena traces. So this is something else you'll find on museum labels that say pallets are associated with malachite and galena. Galena is more of a dynastic era pigmentation used in coal, much less so used in the pre-dynastic era. So in the 19th and 20th century, various archaeologists made various statements. We've already seen Petrie say that palettes were cosmetic use and just for painting the eyes. Caphart simply stated that they were for grinding malachite. Murray said they were just some defense for the eyes. And Adams added that it was cosmetic for the eyes, but also possibly to ward off insects. All of these definitions are essentially grounded in everyday use, and palettes are quite rare. So if this was something that you needed for everyday use, you would expect them to be found in more places. You would expect more people to have them. And even if they didn't have fancy fish palettes or fancy rhomboids, you would expect something else. So somewhat controversially, I'll say that all of these statements are quite reductive, and they're only looking at something on a very basic level. And perhaps the use of cosmetics purely implies these were used for beautification rather than actually something more meaningful and more significant. So I think we should look at palettes as more of an elite item. And this is building on Nathalie Badul's work. If you feel like reading a lengthy and a little bit dry paper, the title's in the bottom of that, and it is a very good paper. And it has informed a number of my views, because we know that palettes had a use in everyday life. We've seen that from the difference in pigmentation that we find on them. And we also know that they had some place in the funerary rituals. Palettes are buried with people, people are buried with malachite on them, people are buried with malachite. So there's certainly different uses for everyday and different uses for funerary. We also see that the animal-shaped palettes share a common language with other Egyptian, let's say, art, visual culture, I would be more inclined to say. Where if we look at pre-dynastic vessels, you'll see animal designs on them, you'll see animal motifs. Some of the other sculptural elements, other amulets, other carvings, they're all of an animal theme, and the palettes fit into that common language. And this common language may not be understood by us now, but would certainly be understood by the people of the time. And we can probably think of palettes in this way as a form of proto-hieroglyph, that essentially the shape of the palette itself forms a hieroglyph and its meaning is denoted by its shape. And we should consider that the palettes were only buried with a very small percentage of people. They're not something everyone had. They're something that only the elites would have had, something which maybe an everyday person could have used an alternative, but we don't find examples of those. So it seems more likely that the palettes were something for elite people to use, and that perhaps they held, it is the standard archaeological answer of, perhaps it held more of a ritual use rather than something more mundane, rather than just simply being a way to create a cosmetic and apply it to yourself. So what can we conclude for this? Essentially, if we start making very simple statements, that's far too reductive. We can't say a palette was just so that you could apply some sort of pigment to your eye, so that you could have a defense against the sun, or so that you could ward off flies. If that was the case, why don't we see more of this from other people? Why don't we see more of this in less elite burials? And as I mentioned towards the start of this, the stone choice was incredibly significant. All of these palettes, whether the culture was in Upper or Lower Egypt, was all created from grey wacke or siltstone from the Wadi Hammamat. This green stone is somehow significant. Perhaps the stone itself was seen to have its own magical properties. Perhaps it had some special meaning just on its own. And we see as we move from the Naqada II phase into Naqada III that access to this material became restricted, that only the high elites could have them. The number of palettes significantly drops. The number of graves found with palettes significantly drops. Those who do have them are privileged enough to have a palette of their own. Maybe they don't have access to a craftsperson to create it into a fancy shape of fish, or maybe they just have to cope with it being essentially a rock that somebody picked up in the quarry. We know that pigments were processed on the surface of palettes. There are palettes that we can find today which have pigment traces, both ochre and malachite. So we know there was some form of pigment processing. We can say categorically they weren't used for grinding malachite, because we've seen that's not how you process malachite. We should probably more accurately say they were used for the crushing of malachite and the production of pigmentation. We also know that the use in settlements is very different to the use in burials. Now, it could be that this settlement use is more ritualistic, where palettes are used as part of a ceremony. Palettes are used for almost a sort of shamanic use, where a tribal leader and elite can be seen to control the animals, take their power, essentially something which we might expect a dynastic king or a dynastic pharaoh to be doing. So this kind of shows the position of palettes in society as maybe something which later these would be roles that would be filled by the king, and at the time of the palettes would be filled by the tribe's leader or the tribe's elite. We can see from lots of burials that palettes are only owned by the elite. There's a very small number of palettes found. Whilst they're one of the most common items, they're the most common items from elite graves, graves that already contain many other fancy objects, not the sort of grave of a common person. And again, that they're using restricted materials and restricted craftspeople who would be able to create these for you. And I think it's fair to say that the palettes do represent a form of proto-hieroglyph, and that their form is indicative of some kind of meaning. Perhaps that explains the commonality of fish more than other animals. And going back to Joe Smolik's paper, he suggests that the turtle is used as a representation of a protective amulet, where the turtle attack any sort of negative entity. But again, fundamentally, we don't know. And we do see palettes moving into the end of the Naqada II phase and towards the Naqada III phase, actually having engraved hieroglyphs on their surface. So in my previous slide, we saw the Min hieroglyph carved onto one of the palettes, which is actually one of the ones in the British Museum. And as we move into more of the ceremonial palettes, or the so-called ceremonial palettes, we see that they're starting to incorporate hieroglyphs. So we suspect that the king on its surface is called Nama because of the serak at the top featuring the catfish. This is kind of the development of hieroglyphs that will form more into the dynastic phase. And I would like to say that we shouldn't call the carved palettes a ceremonial palette, because as we've just discussed, just a simple fish could have many ritualistic ceremonial uses and might not be for just something very simple like decorating one's body. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Thank you for giving up your Saturday to listen to this. To remind anyone who's not a member that ES memberships are available and that there's a fantastic lecture series still going on. And once we're all allowed out of lockdown, we will be able to actually hold the palette workshop and many other activities. And if anyone's got any questions and comments, I would be happy to spend the next few minutes answering those.
Thank you so much, Matt, and particularly thank you for that plug at the end. We do have a full lecture program. Matt has very kindly donated this time for free to the Society, and we're very grateful for that, as with all our speakers doing the same. So please do get over to our website, check out the event program, and if you're not a member already, what are you playing at? Obviously, you should be a member by now. So please do consider going over and joining the Society. Matt, wonderful presentation. Wow, I thought I didn't know a lot about pre-dynastic palettes before this. I didn't realize how much I didn't know about pre-dynastic palettes. So introduction is quite right, and I look forward to more of this. All I can say is what a fantastic way to get the words advantageous cleavage into a presentation at the EES. Really fully appreciative of that.
I'm trying to get it into every paper I write as well.
I think it's going to become my Twitter handle. I think your presentation has really demonstrated the importance of revisiting objects and definitions that we've so often taken for granted. And I'm sure there will be people who've worked with material culture in the room that will know several examples of these misconceptions, let's say, that have become part of the narrative that we take for granted. And it's so great to see somebody take a single topic and really unpack it in such a way that gives us so much more information. Just the fact that these are elite items, I think to anybody who goes around these galleries and saw these palettes may well not appreciate the elite nature of them. So thank you so much for certainly opening my eyes to a different aspect of these items. The questions, I can say, have gone crazy. Thank you to everybody who didn't sort of inundate the chat and have put them in the Q&A. I think we've got a few moments to go through a few. We won't get through all 23 at the moment, but we'll go through a few of them. Anna Garnett and Solange Ashby have asked, how are the Sudanese palettes different in your view? Is this something you've looked at already, or is this something you're hoping to add?
Essentially, it's the material. So Nubian A group seem to have created all of their palettes out of quartz. I probably should have said this in the talk, but one of the reasons that we can see that palettes are elite is because they're made out of this one material from this one place. Fundamentally, you could do this with anything. any moderately hard stone you could use as a palette, but they weren't, with the exception of the Nubian A group, perhaps because they didn't have access to the Wadi Hammamat, perhaps because it had different meanings to them, but theirs are typically quartz and other hard stones, usually a kind of rectangular one. I haven't done very much study into them. I've mostly just found that they exist and excluded them from my current research, mostly because they're not pretty fish.
You've got to draw the boundaries somewhere, but I think it's great to take the model that you've implemented and maybe take that on further in the future. So thank you so much for that. Ramsey Wahba has asked whether the central depression in the palettes was caused by grinding or was created to facilitate grinding. And I think you've already covered that question, but I don't know if you want to elaborate slightly.
My personal opinion is it's only the rhomboids that have that depression, and it's not present on all of the rhomboids. And in my still forthcoming paper, that's about 4 years in production at this point, I've actually studied one of the Manchester objects, and the size of the depression on that one is less than 1% of the pallet's surface. And I think, just thinking logically, it's impossible to use 1% of the surface of something. And malachite doesn't need to be ground. Essentially, you smash it, and then you take those smaller smashed pieces and you crush those further. So realistically, the use of that depression, I think, is essentially you could put your small pieces of malachite, your pre-crushed malachite, in it, and then slowly pinch it out onto the main surface and crush it to a fine powder on the main surface.
So lots of options, really. One person, sorry, I just noticed in the chat was saying that to make up paint would require a palette like this. Is that something you've looked at, paint use on them or making of paint?
Essentially, it's very similar to pigments in general and cosmetics. There's a lot of scholarly debate about what base you would actually use, whether it's oils, fats, different drying oils, non-drying oils, water even. I think Sarah's in the chat and she suggested maybe tiger nuts.
Okay.
Which I still think is a kind of Chinese remedy, but perhaps it's a different context. And a paint would fundamentally be very similar, but what's interesting is in all the pre-dynastic culture, I'm going to make a sweeping statement, in all the pre-dynastic culture I've seen, there's no green paint. We see plenty of ochre, so if we think about the decorated pottery, that's all ochre. Your ostriches or your flamingos or whatever they are painted on the surface in an ochre paint. There's no green malachite paint used. It seems almost exclusively for palettes and almost exclusively perhaps for burials. We know from dynastic times that the green was a sign of rebirth, but I'm always very loath to suggest a dynastic use for pre-dynastic objects, given the time difference between the two.
Sarah has just put in the chat, it's because it's non-toxic and non-drying oil. So very good to have a couple of experimental archaeologists here in the room, let's say, with us. Olivia Kingsman has asked, well, she's praised your presentation, which is great. I will send you a transcript of all these comments. There's some great comments coming through. She's mentioned your intention to catalogue as many palettes as you've been able to find. And she's wondering whether there's a plan to publish this catalogue or to perhaps make it available.
Essentially, yes. I'm hoping to have a website and build some kind of search mechanism so that people can search the data, filter it in different ways for their own research. I would say selfishly, once I've done the first catalogue, I've got a couple of papers I want to publish from it. And once I'm finished with that, then yeah, it's going to be free for everyone.
Fantastic. That sounds exciting and looking forward to seeing that. Susan Biddle has asked, perhaps in some of the less elite burials, they did include grey wax stones, but perhaps their significance wasn't recognised by the excavators. Do you think that that's something that could have happened?
It's always a possibility, but a large pallet-sized stone does still show up as something when you're excavating a burial. So I would say probably not, but there is the possibility.
And someone who has wished to remain anonymous has asked whether or not it's possible to tell whether any of these palettes are fakes. And I suppose maybe that's in reference to the dinosaur that you showed.
Oh, the dinosaur's brilliant. Yes. In theory, yes. There are a couple of known fakes, and it would take a little bit of, I suspect, things like RTI and microscope work and probably some experimental work to look at the tool marks. And from objects I've looked at which are suspected as being fake, if you look at the tool marks, you can kind of see one way or the other, particularly with things like the drill holes. If something's been done with a flint drill, it's very obvious it's been done with a flint drill, rather than more of a modern twist drill.
So based on that sort of taking forward what you just said, it's quite interesting. Julian Hirsch has asked, are there examples of workshops in which the various preforms showing stages in which palettes were made have been found?
Sadly not. There's no real workshop as far as I know. There are palettes in settlement contexts and there are palettes in burial contexts. And the paper that you plugged for me at the start, it actually discusses a piece of a pallet that was found in a rubbish deposit. And I personally wonder if that was a piece of a pallet that was used in everyday life, or if that was a piece of a pallet that was broken during manufacture. There's lots of interesting questions like that, but we can't really say. We do have, I think, some preforms have been found. And there's also, I've seen recently during my cataloguing, that there are pallets that look almost like a preform. I think I saw one the other day that actually came from a burial, but it looked very much like an unfinished fish. So I do wonder if that was more of a preform that had been buried, moreover than just a, dare I say, not very good fish.
It's quite interesting. Somebody, again, an anonymous question, but in the Naqada III, the simpler palettes that you showed, do you think that they suggest mass production because they were easier or quicker to make?
No, it's actually the opposite.
Oh.
Because you see a lot less of them. When you actually look at the frequency, there are many animals, particularly fish, but many other animals as well. When you move into Naqada III, there's a lot less of everything, and the shapes are much more simple. And this is why people have taken it to assume the restriction from the state that you don't have access to the craftspeople who can actually create you a fancy fish or some of the really intricately created things. And essentially you've got someone who can make a square, or they can make a round one, or even that they could give you the materials and then you can form it yourself into a square, which, if you have enough time, is quite an easy process. So no to the answer.
And then last question, because they're still coming through, we're up to 30 now. Have you ever found any sign of a reworked palette by, that was asked by Federica Ugliano? I probably pronounced that wrong.
It's an interesting question. To the question you're probably asking, no. To the actual question, yes. There's, I think it's in Manchester. Campbell, if you're in the chat. There's a palette which is an antelope, like a bound-legged antelope, that's been carved out of what's suspected to have been a fish, but it's suspected that's more of a modern thing. So perhaps an unscrupulous antiques dealer in the 19th century wanted to charge a little bit more for it and chose to carve it into an antelope rather than just a common or garden fish. I haven't seen that of a known provenance palette that was something else and became that. And you would expect to see more reuse in the later phases when materials are a bit more restricted, that perhaps if you broke your palette, you would maybe reshape it into something else.
Fantastic. So, and for everything else, obviously, get on over to the Birmingham Egyptology Journal, download the paper on hopefully Monday. I saw Jen Turner has sent a link. And for everything else, waiting for that catalogue and future lectures. I'd just like to say thank you again to Matt for a brilliant presentation. Thank you to everybody for all of your questions and all of your chat. There's a lot more going on than we've been able to get through. And thank you also to everybody on social media. I'm sure that Matt will have to spend probably the rest of today going through Twitter questions, but just to say that Campbell Price, he has been in the chat and said that he's going to be looking back into that reworked one in Manchester that he suspects the antiquities dealer as well. And we've also seen Ian Trumbull from Bolton saying on Twitter that he's going to have to go and change some gallery labels. So fantastic, an immediate impact of that lecture. So thank you so much. Thank you, Matt, again for the presentation, and thank you to everybody for joining us today on a Saturday. And I look forward, hopefully, to seeing you all on Tuesday at the next EES lecture. And hopefully, again, we'll have Matt on the program in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Super. Bye for now, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.